Today we will be going through 15 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong, previously covered on our channel. In this marathon, each story is not just terrifying, but also highlights that caving requires careful planning and attention to detail, as even the slightest oversight can turn a thrilling adventure into a tragic nightmare. As always, viewer discretion is advised. This story takes place on March 31st, 2012. Weeki Wachee Springs, Florida, is known for its crystal-clear waters and vast underwater cave systems, attracting divers from around the world. Among them was 29-year-old Marson Kay, a skilled and experienced cave diver who had made countless dives into this breathtaking yet treacherous environment. That day, he was diving with the Karst Underwater Research KUR team, a group dedicated to exploring and mapping underwater caves. The team's plan was routine: a series of controlled dives to document passages and ensure the safety of divers navigating these challenging environments. Marson, confident in his abilities and familiar with the caves, was performing his final dive of the day. He was meticulous in his preparation, double-checking his tanks, equipment, and dive line before descending into the labyrinth below. The dive began smoothly. Marson and his team followed the guideline, a crucial tether that ensures divers can retrace their steps in the often disorienting maze of underwater caves. They moved in unison, their lights cutting through the dark, silent depths as they documented the cave's features. At depths exceeding 100 feet, the risks were ever present. The slightest mistake could prove fatal. Divers are trained to keep a steady pace to avoid nitrogen buildup in their bloodstream, which can lead to decompression sickness. Marson was aware of these dangers, his every move calculated and precise. As the team completed their objectives and began their ascent, Marson seemed composed. He stayed close to the dive line, methodically navigating through the narrow corridors. At approximately 4:30 p.m., something changed. As the team approached a section near the cave's exit, Marson suddenly veered away from the dive line. He swam upward into a tight crevice, a space so narrow that even side-mount divers would struggle to fit. His movements were rapid and erratic, unlike the deliberate precision he was known for. The other divers, noticing his deviation, attempted to signal him using their dive lights. They flashed beams in his direction, a universal underwater signal for stop. When light signals failed, they tried touch communication, tapping him gently to regain his attention. But Marson's responses were inconsistent and increasingly frantic. He pushed further into the crevice, his body twisting to navigate the restrictive space. Panic rippled through the team as they realized something was wrong. Unbeknownst to the team, Marson was suffering from a cerebral arterial gas embolism. This condition, caused by rapid ascent and subsequent gas expansion in the bloodstream, disrupts blood flow to the brain. Within seconds, the embolism can cause disorientation, confusion, and even blindness or paralysis. Marson's behavior, a sudden departure from the dive line and his irrational decision to enter the crevice, was likely the result of his deteriorating mental state. He was no longer thinking clearly, and his actions became increasingly erratic as the embolism took hold. Safety divers, stationed nearby and equipped with additional gas cylinders, watched helplessly as Marson wedged himself deeper into the crevice. His movements were erratic, and attempts to communicate with him were met with no clear response. 5 minutes passed. Despite their efforts to reach him, Marson's regulator was no longer in use. Divers realized that he had likely lost consciousness. The situation was dire, but the narrow confines of the crevice made reaching him nearly impossible. The team immediately signaled for the surface rescue crew, who were on standby. Every second counted, but underwater rescues are slow by necessity, with divers unable to move too quickly without risking their own safety. When the rescue diver finally reached Marson, it was too late. His body was unresponsive, his tanks still half full, and his equipment functioning properly. The embolism had caused him to lose consciousness and ultimately drown in the tight space where he had become trapped. Marson's body was brought to the surface just before 5 p.m. The recovery team was somber as they emerged from the water, their faces heavy with grief. They had done everything possible, but the unpredictability of an embolism had taken Marson from them in a matter of minutes. In their post-incident statement, the KUR team acknowledged the unpredictable nature of embolisms and the importance of adhering to safety protocols. They emphasized that Marson's decision to enter the crevice was not a deliberate act, but a tragic consequence of his medical condition. His final dive, though tragic, highlighted the profound respect required for the underwater world, a realm of both breathtaking beauty and unforgiving peril. It was February 12th, 2011. Winter was starting to loosen its grip, but the air still carried that sharp, biting chill. 10 students from the University of Florida had set out for an adventure. They were a tight-knit group, always seeking thrills together. Rock climbing, diving, you name it. But this time, they had their sights on something different. Ellison's Cave. Now, if you don't know Ellison's Cave, let me paint a picture for you. It's a colossal underground wonder in Georgia's Pigeon Mountain, with depths plunging over 1,000 feet. Its fantastic pit is infamous a sheer 586-foot drop that's both breathtaking and terrifying. For these students, though, it was an irresistible challenge. Leading the group was Grant Lackenbach, a bright, spirited 20-year-old who was days away from his birthday. He and his best friend Michael were the kind of guys who thrived on adrenaline. They were excited, maybe a little too much so. You see, they didn't exactly come prepared for the harsh conditions. Wearing just shorts and t-shirts, they underestimated how brutal this cave could be, especially in winter. The group arrived in Georgia the night before, crashing at a hotel near the mountain. By morning, they were ready to tackle the cave. They left their phones behind, a decision that would haunt them later, packed their gear, and started the climb to Ellison's Cave. As they ascended, the cold seeped in, but they brushed it off, eager to dive into the adventure. The cave's entrance was narrow, almost unassuming, but it led to a labyrinth of awe-inspiring chambers and pits. The plan was simple: explore for a bit and head back out. But fate had other plans. At some point, one of their backpacks slipped and tumbled into a pit called the warm-up pit. It's a vertical drop of about 125 feet. Not as deep as the Fantastic Pit, but still incredibly dangerous. The pit was near a waterfall, and the air around it was frigid, like stepping into a freezer. But that backpack had essential supplies, so they decided it was worth retrieving. Grant was the first to go down. He insisted, said he could handle it. That's just who he was, the kind of guy who'd step up when something needed doing. He had no way of knowing what was waiting for him down there. As he started his descent, everything seemed fine at first. His friends above kept shouting encouragements, but the deeper he went, the colder it got. Icy spray from the nearby waterfall began hitting him, soaking through his clothes and chilling him to the bone. The roar of the water grew louder, so loud that even shouting became useless. And then, halfway down, disaster. The rope jammed or froze. No one's sure exactly what happened, but it stopped moving. Grant was stuck, hanging there in the freezing air, the waterfall's spray now pouring over him. He called out, trying to sound calm, but you could hear the panic in his voice. His shivering grew violent. His hands were too numb to grip properly. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was eating away at him, stealing his strength. Above, his friends froze, realizing something was terribly wrong. They shouted down, but the roar of the waterfall drowned out most of their words. That's when Michael made his decision. He couldn't stand it anymore. He saw his best friend dangling there, helpless, and he couldn't just watch. Without hesitation, he grabbed the same rope and started down. Michael was in a hurry, too much of a hurry. The cold hit him fast, but he pushed through, desperate to reach Grant. When he finally got there, what he saw was horrifying. Grant wasn't moving much anymore. His hands fumbled uselessly at the rope, and his voice was weak, slurred. The cold had him in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. Michael tried to help, but the waterfall wasn't going to make it easy. The spray drenched them both, turning the rope into a slick, icy snake that refused to cooperate. Michael struggled to untangle Grant, his own fingers stiffening with the cold. And then, just like Grant, the rope trapped Michael too. He was stuck. Now both of them were dangling there, side by side, completely at the mercy of the cave. The waterfall pounded down, its freezing spray soaking them through, numbing their bodies and minds. They tried calling out, but their voices were faint, strangled by the cold and the roar of the water. Above, their friends were frantic. They shouted encouragements, begged the boys to hang on, but the minutes dragged on and their voices got no answer. Below, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was lethal. Grant was slipping away, his movements slowing until he was barely twitching. Michael, too, started to fade, his breath shallow and his words slurred as hypothermia set in. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? The cold so intense it feels like knives piercing your skin, the weight of the rope digging into your body, the helplessness of knowing you're trapped and there's nothing you can do. And worse, knowing your best friend is right there, suffering the same fate, and you can't save him. Realizing they needed help, some of the group scrambled back to their cars, retrieved their phones, and called for rescue. Their friends were desperate, but by the time the help arrived, it was too late. The rescuers found them hanging there, lifeless. When you think about it, all they could see was that rope, silent, unmoving, holding two young men who had so much life left to live. It's a pain that doesn't go away, no matter how much time passes. The rescuers faced an agonizing 6-hour operation to recover them. When they finally emerged, the scene was one of unspeakable grief. This story stays with them, not just because of its tragedy, but because it being a reminder of how fragile life is and how a single misstep can change everything. Grant and Michael were brave, no doubt about it. But even the bravest among us are no match for nature's unforgiving might. It was February 1994, somewhere on a Caribbean island, surrounded by warm beaches, endless blue skies, and the kind of peace you only get on vacation. David Parks and his buddy Jerry were living that dream on vacation and were full of that carefree energy. That's when they heard from locals about a deep, mysterious cave with a pool inside. The kind of thing you don't think twice about exploring when you're in paradise. They weren't experienced cavers or divers, but that didn't seem to matter to them. They grabbed snorkeling gear, a couple of diving lights, and went off chasing adventure. When they found the cave, it was more intimidating than they'd expected. A vertical shaft, 70 feet straight down. But they didn't hesitate. Carefully, they climbed down, gripping the damp walls, each step taking them further into the dark unknown. At the bottom, the space opened into a chamber. In the middle of the chamber was the pool they'd been told about. It looked calm, but it had that spooky stillness that comes with deep, dark water. What they didn't know was that this pool was connected to narrow underwater tunnels, passages that threaded through the cave, with only small air pockets scattered along the way. But to them, this was exciting. They slipped into the water, the cold shocking their skin as they adjusted. With their light slicing through the darkness, they swam into the first tunnel, surfacing now and then to catch their breath in the air pockets. The passages were narrow, the walls closing in uncomfortably as they made their way forward. After some time, they surfaced in a larger cavern. This new room felt massive compared to the tight spaces they'd just come through. There was a small rock ledge where they could rest, and for a moment, they just sat there, catching their breath and taking it all in. But then it hit them. They were deep inside the cave, far from any easy exit. It was time to head back. David took the lead. At first, everything seemed fine as they swam through the murky water. But then, things took a turn. Their movement kicked up silt from the bottom, turning the water from clear to a thick, milky mess. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. It was like trying to find your way through a blizzard with no landmarks. Somewhere in the chaos, David lost Jerry. He turned, trying to find him, but it was useless. Worse, he lost his sense of direction entirely. The tunnels all looked the same now, and the silt made it impossible to tell which way was out. Panic started to creep in, his chest tightening as his lungs began to burn. David realized he was swimming deeper into the cave instead of out. He couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe, and the silence underwater was deafening. Just when he thought he couldn't hold his breath any longer, his hand broke the surface of an air pocket. He shot up too fast, smashing his head into a stalactite. The pain was sharp, but he barely noticed. It was overshadowed by the sheer relief of being able to breathe again. The air pocket was small, the ceiling pressing down on him like a coffin lid. He clung to a narrow rock shelf, gasping for breath, the stale air filling his lungs. He could feel the weight of the cave above him, and the silence in that pocket was crushing. Every second he stayed there felt like a countdown to the end. Meanwhile, Jerry had made it back to the entrance. He surfaced and waited, expecting David to follow. But minutes passed, then more. Panic set in. He started shouting into the water, shining his dive light into the tunnel, hoping for any sign of movement. Back in the air pocket, David knew he couldn't stay there much longer. The air wasn't clean, and he was running out of options. He put his mask back on and submerged himself, turning off his light. Maybe, just maybe, he could spot a glimmer of Jerry's light through the murk, and then he saw it, a faint glow, so dim it was barely there. But it was something. Taking the deepest breath he could, he pushed off the rock shelf and swam toward it. His lungs screamed for air as he moved, his body on the edge of giving out. Finally, his head broke the surface, and he was greeted by the blinding beam of Jerry's dive light. He'd made it. Exhausted, shaking, and gasping for breath, he clung to the edge of the pool as Jerry pulled him out. They climbed out of the water and back up the shaft, the weight of what had just happened sinking in with every step. When they finally emerged into the sunlight, it felt like breaking free from a nightmare. Later, they shared the story with experienced divers, who told them just how lucky they'd been. Those air pockets they'd relied on, they don't always contain breathable air, and that silt they stirred up, it could have stayed suspended for days, making it impossible to find the way out. David and Jerry had survived, but they knew it could have gone the other way so easily. That cave had almost claimed them, and it left them with a lesson they'd never forget. The earth doesn't care about your plans. If you're not prepared, it will swallow you whole. On August 4th, 2006, Emily Bacon went on a trip to Glade Cave in Virginia with her Girl Scout troop, which was supposed to be the highlight of a week-long camp. Everyone had been properly briefed, equipped, and supervised. Safety was the top priority, but even the best plans can't account for everything, as Emily would soon find out that well-prepared adventures can take a dangerous turn in no time. The entrance to Glade Cave wasn't imposing, just a small gap in the rocky hillside. As the group descended, the passage narrowed, requiring some belly crawling to navigate. This section wasn't overly tight, but it forced everyone to shuffle along carefully. Emily was toward the middle of the group, cautiously working her way down a slight slope in the passage. She reached a spot where two large boulders formed a natural obstacle, wedged tightly together. The passage sloped upward just slightly here, making the footing tricky. One counselor was ahead, guiding the group through, while others offered encouragement from behind. Emily moved to slide down past the top boulder. As she made contact with it, the rock shifted. It started as nothing more than a faint scrape, stone against stone. At first, it barely registered, but something about it sent a jolt of unease through her. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, heart pounding like a warning drum. Still, she pressed on, inching forward. That's when it happened. Without warning, the boulder above her shifted violently, slamming downward. The one below followed, crushing any hope of escape. The impact was brutal, jarring her entire body. The sharp edge of the upper rock tore into her side, pinning her in place. Worse still, her chin got wedged painfully between the lower boulder and the unyielding ceiling of the narrow passage. She was trapped, and the realization hit like a second blow. It hit her like a shock, a numbing disbelief that froze her in place for a split second. Then came the pain, sharp and unforgiving, as if her entire right side was being crushed under the jagged edges of the boulders. Each shallow breath felt like a stab, sending waves of agony through her chest. She instinctively tried to shift, to free herself, but the rocks wouldn't budge. What had been a tight but manageable crawl just moments earlier now felt like a vice, squeezing tighter with every passing second. There was no room to move, no way to escape. The others quickly realized what had happened. A counselor scrambled back to her and assessed the situation. Emily was completely stuck, her right arm pinned, her torso compressed by the weight of the boulders, and her head wedged uncomfortably. Her legs were free, but the angle of the passage made it impossible for her to push herself out. She was trapped. The group tried to free her, but every attempt to shift the boulders seemed to make things worse. One counselor left immediately to seek help, climbing back through the cave's narrow passages to call for rescue. The others stayed with Emily, covering her with blankets and doing their best to keep her calm. They talked to her constantly, reassuring her that help was on the way. But Emily's pain was undeniable, and the weight pressing on her side made it hard to breathe. Several squads, including the Mount Solon Volunteer Rescue Squad, came prepared with specialized equipment for cave rescues. The passage leading to Emily was already tight, but with the boulders shifted into place, it had become a nearly impassable choke point. The rescuers had to approach methodically, carefully maneuvering their tools through the confined space. The first challenge was stabilizing the boulders. If they shifted any further, Emily could be crushed. The team used inflatable air bladders to create enough space to work without dislodging the rocks. Once the area was secure, they began chiseling away at the upper boulder, The rescuers took turns, the sharp clang of metal on rock echoing through the cave. Emily's condition was deteriorating. The pressure on her side was cutting off circulation, and the awkward angle of her body was putting strain on her neck and back. She was in excruciating pain. One rescuer likened her position to being wedged inside a stone coffin, unable to move, barely able to breathe. After hours of chiseling, the upper boulder was finally broken into smaller, more manageable pieces. The team used hooks and ropes to move the fragments out of the way. Each piece removed brought a small measure of relief, but the lower boulder still pinned Emily's head, its sharp edge cutting into her flesh. With the upper boulder gone, the team began digging around the lower rock, using hand tools to chip away at the packed dirt and stone. The process was painstaking, and every movement had to be precise. Too much force could destabilize the remaining rock, but too little would mean leaving Emily trapped. Finally, after more than 2 hours of grueling effort, the lower boulder was freed enough to be moved. The boulder wedged back to its original position, releasing Emily's head from its grip. She was finally free. The rescuers carefully pulled her out of the passage and secured her in a stretcher, ensuring her spine was supported as they prepared to move her. Her right side was a mess, deep purple bruises already forming, her chin scraped raw where it had been wedged between the unforgiving rocks. Worse, her right arm hung limp. She had lost all feeling in it. The tight confines of the cave made every step a challenge, but the team was relentless, navigating the jagged and narrow passage with an almost superhuman focus. When Emily finally emerged into the open air, it was as though she had surfaced from a nightmare. The harsh brightness of daylight felt almost surreal after the oppressive darkness. Paramedics were waiting, springing into action the moment she was clear of the cave's mouth. They assessed her injuries quickly but thoroughly, their faces etched with concern. Emily's pain was evident in every shallow breath, but she had defied the odds, surviving an ordeal that had nearly claimed her. Every person there knew how close she had come to tragedy. On April 18, 2004, Aaron Stockton and Jim Burke set out to explore a cave newly discovered near the Dark Canyon Lookout Tower in New Mexico. As experienced explorers, they had spent years chasing the thrill of the unknown, venturing into dark, uncharted caverns. The idea of being one of the first humans to set foot in a cave, untouched for millennia, was irresistible. They arrived at the cave in the late afternoon. It was a modest, unassuming opening in the rocky terrain, partially obscured by loose rubble. The sun was low, so they knew they didn't have much time before nightfall, but decided they could at least get a look inside. Burke volunteered to go first. He was lean and had more experience with tight squeezes, so he thought he could navigate the narrow opening without much trouble. It further led to a downward shaft that eventually opened to a vast network of tunnels. As Burke worked his way down, a cascade of small stones tumbled loose, causing the two men to pause. This wasn't unusual. Caving often involves unstable ground, but the rocks didn't stop. A moment later, a loud crack echoed through the air as the ground shifted. Before Burke could react, 3 large rocks dislodged and slammed down into the hole behind him. The air filled with dust, choking the narrow passage. Burke instinctively pressed himself against the cramped walls of the cave as the rocks crashed down, missing him by mere inches. He could feel the vibration of the impact through the stone, the sound reverberating in the small space. For a terrifying moment, he thought the entire entrance would cave in and bury him alive. When the dust settled, Burke found himself immobilized, the massive rocks that had sealed the passage and left no room to escape. He was trapped in a tight, damp space, in a sitting position, with back against the cave wall and one of the 3 boulders just a few centimeters away from his face. His heart pounded as he assessed his situation. Miraculously, despite the violence of the collapse, he was unscathed. The rocks had fallen just a few inches enough away to spare him, a stroke of fortune he wouldn't fully grasp until later. For a moment, Stockton stood frozen, staring at the blocked entrance in disbelief. Then, adrenaline kicked in. He dropped to his knees and began clawing at the rubble, pulling away smaller rocks to assess the situation. He called out Burke, hoping for a response. A muffled voice came through after a tense few seconds, telling him he's unharmed. Hearing that Burke was uninjured was a relief, but the situation was dire. Burke might be alive and unharmed for now, but the way out was completely blocked, and any further movement of the unstable debris could spell disaster, crushing him. The race to save his friend had begun. Stockton quickly got to work, using his hands and whatever tools he had to create an opening. He managed to clear a hole just big enough to pass sound through, 6 inches by 12 inches. Through it, they could communicate. Burke assured Stockton that he wasn't hurt, but he couldn't move in the tight space. The air was damp and cool, and he'd started to feel the chill creeping in. Stockton knew he couldn't free Burke alone. The rocks blocking the passage were too large to move without equipment, and there was no way to ensure the remaining debris wouldn't collapse further. Thinking quickly, Stockton found some tree branches nearby and used them to stabilize the precarious rocks above the entrance. The last thing they needed was another collapse. He promised Burke he would get help and set off for the dark canyon lookout tower, hiking as fast as he could over the rugged terrain. The hike was grueling, the evening air cold and sharp, but Stockton pressed on, determined to save his friend. By the time he reached help, night had fallen. The search and rescue team assessed the situation and made a critical decision. Attempting a rescue in the dark would be risky. The entrance was unstable, and rushing to act could put rescuers in harm's way. They decided to wait until morning, when conditions would be safer. Still, Stockton couldn't bear the thought of leaving Burke alone in the cold all night. He gathered a small team of volunteers and essential supplies, food, water, blankets, and they began the trek back to the cave. The hike took 2 hours through uneven, rocky terrain. By midnight, they reached the entrance. Using a long stick, they carefully pushed the supplies through the small opening Stockton had made earlier. Burke was grateful for the provisions and reported that he was cold, but otherwise in good spirits. The team stayed near the entrance, keeping watch through the night. All they could do now was wait for daylight and the arrival of more help. At first light on April 19th, the main rescue operation began. About 30 people, a mix of volunteer cavers and trained rescuers, gathered at the site. The team carefully evaluated the situation, deciding that shoring, the process of reinforcing the walls of the cave, was unnecessary. However, the effort to remove the blockage would be no small task. The massive boulders, each weighing over 300 pounds, stood between Burke and freedom. The rescuers began by clearing away the smaller rocks by hand, slowly widening the entrance. It was tedious, back-breaking work, but everyone was focused on the goal. The larger boulders required a combination of ingenuity and brute strength. Using bolt anchors, a come-along, a hand-operated winch, and sheer muscle power, they managed to move the first boulder out of the way. The second boulder proved even more stubborn. Every shift of the rock threatened to destabilize the surrounding debris, and the team had to proceed with extreme caution. Hours passed as they inched it free. The wind picked up, with gusts reaching 50 miles per hour, adding another layer of difficulty. A National Guard helicopter that had been on standby was called off due to the weather, leaving the rescuers entirely on their own. By late morning, the final obstacle was removed. Stockton was at the front of the group when Burke finally emerged from the darkness, blinking against the bright sunlight. He was covered in dirt and visibly exhausted, but unharmed. Cheers and relieved smiles spread through the group. The ordeal had lasted nearly 20 hours, but Burke was safe. The rescue team helped Burke gather his strength, and together they began the 2-hour hike back to the dark canyon lookout tower. Despite their fatigue, the sense of accomplishment buoyed their spirits. By 4:30 p.m., the last of the rescuers had packed up and headed home. For Stockton and Burke, the experience was a wake-up call. Lost Fossil Cave may not have claimed a life that day, but it left a lasting mark on everyone involved. On March 13, 2007, Christopher Peake, 27, and 3 companions, including his brother, descended into Turtle Graveyard Cave at 10:15 p.m. for what they believed would be a straightforward exploration. The group brought minimal equipment, 2 flashlights and a couple of chemical lights, and relied on an old 1-inch diameter rope for the vertical descent into the cave. The rope, visibly worn and laid dry from years of use, was their only means of access to the cave's lower chambers. As the group prepared to descend, no one questioned the condition of the rope. It had been used countless times before, even for pulling heavy loads like cars, and its frailty went unnoticed or ignored. Christopher, ready to make his descent, took hold of the rope. Without a helmet, harness, or belay system, he relied solely on his grip and the rope's integrity to guide him down. He moved steadily, hand over hand, into the dimly lit shaft below. From above, Christopher's brother kept a close eye on the rope. As Christopher descended further, the tension caused the fibers to stretch unnaturally thin. The frayed strands began to separate, their weakness now impossible to ignore. His brother shouted down to him, warning him that the rope would snap at any time. Hearing the panic from above, Christopher instinctively tried to speed up his descent, gripping the rope tightly and moving faster than before. Each sudden movement sent shocks through the overstressed rope. The fibers started straining under the weight, making it stretch dangerously. But before Christopher could react, the inevitable happened. Halfway through his descent, the rope suddenly gave way with an audible snap. Dry rotted and brittle, it could no longer bear Christopher's weight. He plunged between 30 and 50 feet, hitting a rocky ledge with a sickening thud. The impact sent him spinning into another free fall, this time dropping another 30 feet. Below, he struck the ground head first, his skull slamming into the unforgiving rock. His body crumpled in a heap. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came shallow, irregular breaths as Christopher drifted in and out of consciousness. Above, his friends and brother were paralyzed with shock. His brother shouted, leaning over the edge, his flashlight beam trembling in his hands. Far below, Christopher groaned but couldn't respond back properly. The group quickly realized they were in an impossible situation. With no other rope or vertical gear, there was no way to descend safely to Christopher. As he drifted in and out of his consciousness, his cries of pain grew louder, begging them to save him. From the dim light above, they could see him writhing in agony. His movements weren't normal. His brother, overcome with emotion, began to climb down using his bare hands, ignoring the warnings of his friends. They grabbed his arms, pulling him back and telling him that it's dangerous. Doing that, he would risk falling down and injuring himself as well. Tears streamed down his brother's face as he reluctantly agreed. Realizing that the time in hand was short, one of the group members on the surface sprinted out of the cave to seek assistance. The others, still shaken, remained in the cave, calling out to Christopher and shining their limited light sources into the darkness. Emergency responders arrived in force, including teams from the Paulette Volunteer Fire Department, Maynardville Fire Department, and Knoxville Volunteer Rescue Squad. Rescue crews immediately assessed the situation and began assembling a vertical raise system. Inside the cave, Christopher's condition was worsening. By now, it was well past midnight, and the frigid cave air compounded the urgency of the rescue. Rescue teams began setting up a vertical raise system to safely extract Christopher. The broken rope still dangled limply from above. It was obvious to the seasoned rescuers that the rope had been severely compromised long before the group's ill-prepared descent. With no reliable rope left, the team had to rig a new system from scratch. Hours passed as they carefully navigated the vertical shaft, their every movement calculated to avoid further risk. By the time rescuers reached Christopher, he was barely conscious. Blood loss and shock had taken their toll. His head injury was severe, and his breathing was labored. Despite his critical condition, he had survived the fall. They stabilized him as best they could and began the arduous task of lifting him to safety. After hours of careful maneuvering, Christopher was lifted out of the cave and airlifted to a nearby hospital. His condition was critical, with severe head trauma and multiple fractures. The others still inside the cave were assisted out by rescue teams, shaken but uninjured. As the rescuers packed up their gear, one veteran member of the team remarked on the group's glaring oversight. That rope was used for pulling cars. They used it for everything. You have to treat your ropes with respect. Your life hangs on the rope's integrity. It took Christopher months to recover fully, with a lot of medical care and therapy. The experience left him with lasting memories and scars. This story takes place in the Nutty Putty Cave, but it's not about John Jones. For years, Nutty Putty, with its tight tunnels and twisting passageways, lured thrill seekers, promising excitement and the ultimate test of endurance. But it also carried a grim reputation, a ticking clock waiting for tragedy to strike. It was 2009 when the cave finally claimed its most infamous victim, John Edward Jones. That day marked the end of Nutty Putty as an adventurer's playground. Authorities decided to seal the cave for good, saying enough was enough. But John's was not the first close call. Let's go back 10 years. On 28th July 1999, two teenagers, Chris Hales and Chris Morrow, nearly met the same fate. They were just 17, full of life, and eager to make memories during their last summer before high school graduation. Their plan? Drive 70 miles south of Salt Lake City with a group of friends, set up camp, and dive into Nutty Putty Cave the next morning. It was meant to be a fun, harmless adventure. The night before, the group camped under the stars, sharing laughs, stories, and the kind of unspoken excitement that comes when you're standing on the edge of something unknown. By morning, they were ready. At 9 a.m., they stepped into the cold, damp darkness of Nutty Putty. At first, it was thrilling, crawling through narrow passages, squeezing through crevices, and marveling at the strange, alien-like beauty of the cave's formations. But then Morrow and Hales decided to break off from the group. They wanted a challenge. They headed toward a section called the Birth Canal, infamous for its tight, unforgiving spaces. Here's where things took a wrong turn, like literally. Morrow led the way, belly crawling through the tiny passageway, sucking in his stomach to squeeze through the gaps. Hales followed close behind. But Morrow made a critical error. He veered into the wrong tunnel, one that sloped downward and narrowed as it went. At first, he didn't realize his mistake. He kept pushing forward, head first, until the walls of the tunnel began to press in on him. Then it hit him. He was stuck. Panic set in. Morrow shouted back to Hales, warning him not to follow, but it was too late. Hales, now crawling downward and upside down, found himself lodged as well. Both boys were trapped, unable to move forward or backward. Their screams echoed through the cave. Luckily, their friends heard them and scrambled back to the surface to call for help. Within an hour, a team of about 40 rescuers arrived. They brought ropes, tools, and, most importantly, hope. While the rescue operation got underway, Morrow and Hales clung to their wits. Friends crawled back to them, offering water and snacks, trying to keep their spirits up. The boys joked, prayed, and did everything they could to stay calm. It wasn't easy. The weight of the earth pressing down on them was suffocating, not just physically, but mentally. Outside the cave, Morrow's mother had arrived. The look on her face said everything: fear, helplessness. A mother's desperate hope that this wouldn't be the day she lost her son. Inside, rescuers worked tirelessly. The plan was simple in theory, but brutal in execution. Tie ropes around their feet and pull. The team first focused on Hales. Hours passed as they carefully maneuvered ropes, adjusting and testing, trying not to cause further injury. At last, around 10:30 p.m., after more than 12 hours of being wedged in that hellish tunnel, Hales was free. The clock kept ticking for Morrow. Rescuers knew time wasn't on their side, but they refused to give up. Slowly, carefully, they inched him out. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Morrow emerged from the cave, battered and bruised, but alive. Both boys were lucky. Their injuries were minor, just scrapes and bruises. Remarkably, they even managed to laugh about it afterward, calling it a story they'd never forget. Morrow, unbelievably, returned to Nutty Putty twice more before it was sealed in 2009. He even revisited the spot where he'd been stuck, this time making it out unscathed. But the cave didn't always offer second chances. When John Jones became trapped in an eerily similar situation a decade later, the outcome wasn't the same. His death was the breaking point. Nutty Putty's dangerous allure had cost too much. Authorities sealed it shut, forever entombing the risks and memories within. For those who survived it, Nutty Putty was a test of courage and endurance. For those who didn't, it became a haunting reminder of nature's unforgiving side. It was Memorial Day weekend, 1980. A team from the Motherlode Grotto set out to explore Church Cave in Kings Canyon National Park. The group, Dave Cowan, Paul Graves, Jack Espina, Bob Pine, and Eric Popoff, was experienced, maybe even a little overconfident. They weren't rookies. They knew what they were doing. But let me tell you, no amount of preparation can match what nature throws at you sometimes. They started their trek in the morning, hiking up steep, rugged paths through thick pine forests. The kind of trail where every step feels like work, and you have to watch your footing because one wrong step means twisting an ankle. But spirits were high. You know how it is, laughing, joking, taking in the beauty of the day, and imagining the adventure waiting underground. By the time they reached Church Cave around 9:30 a.m., their excitement was electric. Descending into the cave, they felt that rush you only get when you step into a world that doesn't feel like it should exist. The air gets cooler, dampness clings to your skin, and the sound of your breath echoes back at you. They rappelled down into the first section, their lights casting eerie shapes on the walls. They found themselves in a chamber, a tight space, the kind that makes you feel like the earth is giving you a hug, but not the comforting kind. The walls seemed to press in, and the stillness was almost deafening. And that's when it happened. A deep rumble. It wasn't like anything they'd felt before. The ground beneath them shuddered, and the cave roared like a living thing. A 6.0 earthquake had struck. Can't imagine the terror they must have felt, clinging to the walls as the world around them shifted. Dust filled the air, rocks loosened and tumbled, and the ceiling creaked like it was considering coming down altogether. When the shaking finally stopped, there was this moment of eerie silence. I bet their hearts were pounding out of their chests. They were alive, but they weren't out of danger. Not by a long shot. They knew they had to get out. The cave could collapse at any moment, and aftershocks were practically guaranteed. As they started their climb back toward the entrance, the situation went from bad to worse. Barely 20 minutes later, a 5.7 aftershock hit. The ground groaned, and rocks from the canyon above began raining down. You've probably felt earthquakes before, but let me tell you, being underground during one is an entirely different beast. Every vibration feels amplified, like the earth itself is trying to swallow you. The group pressed on, reaching a section known ominously as the torture chamber. If a part of a cave has a name like that, you know it's not going to be fun. This was a steep, narrow chute they'd climbed down earlier, but now they had to go up. It was slow, careful work. One by one, they started the ascent. Jack Espina was leading the climb when the worst happened. Another massive quake, a second 6.0, hit. The cave came alive again, shaking violently. Jack lost his grip and fell, slamming into the rock as he slid back down the chute. He came to a sudden stop, wedged tightly between two boulders. Meanwhile, the rest of the group was fighting to stay upright as the quake rattled the cave. Dust and pebbles poured down like a waterfall. Jack was screaming, his voice echoing through the chamber. Trapped, unable to move, and surrounded by chaos, he struggled to free himself, panic taking over as the rumbling continued. Pebbles and dirt cascaded down around him. Below him, the rest of the team was scrambling for footing as the quake continued to shake the cave. When the shaking stopped, the others rushed to help him. It took ropes, coordination, and sheer will to pull Jack free from the crevice. He was banged up, bruised, shaken, and probably questioning every decision that led him into that cave. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving. As they neared the entrance, the earth trembled again and again. Aftershocks kept them on edge, forcing them to freeze in place, hugging the cold rock and praying the walls wouldn't collapse. Every movement was a gamble. Would the next step be their last? Finally, after what must have felt like a nightmare, they saw daylight, that faint, blessed glow of freedom. They staggered out, battered and bloodied, but alive. The earth gave one last shake as they exited. A 5.7 aftershock that sent more rocks tumbling behind them. They made it. Barely. Church Cave didn't collapse, but it came close. And those men? They carried the marks of that day with them. Not just the physical scars, but the memories of how close they came to being buried alive. Let me tell you about a day that started with adventure, but quickly spiraled into a nightmare. A tale of tight spaces, sheer willpower, and a race against time. On July 19, 2010, Maya Hirsch, a 25-year-old, entered Rattlesnake Cave in Massachusetts, a place as challenging as it was dangerous. Maya wasn't new to caving. She'd been in Rattlesnake Cave before, even solo, and had managed to navigate its twists and turns without much trouble. On this particular day, she was accompanied by friends or family. Reports differ, but what's clear is that she felt confident entering the cave. It wasn't just about thrill-seeking. Caving for Maya was an escape, a way to push her limits and connect with the underground world. Rattlesnake Cave, also called Gutter Cave, is notorious for its narrow, claustrophobic passages. The entrance itself is a tight squeeze. The path descends sharply, levels out for a bit, and then drops into a small chamber about 30 feet below the surface. Around 1 p.m., Maya decided to explore this section. She slid down the steep passage leading to the chamber, barely fitting through the tight, 1-foot-wide space. At first, everything seemed fine. Maya moved through the passages with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. The walls, though jagged, didn't faze her. She had navigated tight spaces before, and this didn't feel any different. But when she tried to climb back up the passage, she realized she was in trouble. The steep incline, combined with the smooth yet sharp walls of the cave, made it nearly impossible to gain any traction. She tried twisting her body, pressing her hands and feet against the walls, and wiggling her way upward. But the passage was relentless. Maya quickly found herself wedged in place. The narrowness of the passage seemed to clamp down on her, and every attempt to move only made the situation worse. Her body began to swell slightly, a natural response to immobility and stress, and the cave walls seemed to tighten their grip. Hours ticked by as she tried everything she could think of to free herself. She pressed her hands and feet against the walls, attempting to leverage herself upward, but the cave's unyielding design made progress impossible. The more she struggled, the more helpless she felt, and panic began to creep in. By 6 p.m., her friends realized she wasn't going to get out on her own. They scrambled back to the surface and called for help. What followed was an extraordinary rescue effort involving about 20 responders. These were skilled rescuers, trained for situations like this, but even they weren't prepared for the challenges that Rattlesnake Cave would throw at them. The first problem was the cave itself. Only 4 or 5 of the rescuers were slim enough to fit into the narrow passage. And even among them, the steep decline at the entrance proved to be a formidable obstacle. It became clear that only one rescuer could be in the passage at a time, and even reaching Maya was a challenge. When the first rescuer made it down to her, they tried the simplest solution first, tossing her a rope. The idea was to pull her out by her arms or feet, but the plan quickly failed. Maya was too tightly wedged in the passage, and the angle of the tunnel made it impossible to generate the force needed to dislodge her. Each attempt seemed to drive her further into the constriction, making the situation even more dire. As hours passed, the rescuers had to get creative. They handed Maya a hammer and chisel, asking her to chip away at the rock around her. Imagine that for a moment. You're trapped, physically exhausted and terrified. Yet now you're expected to carve your way out of the cave. But Maya didn't hesitate. She picked up the tools and began chipping away, focusing on widening the tightest section of the passage. Every swing of the hammer echoed through the narrow space, a small yet determined fight against the oppressive weight of the earth around her. Meanwhile, the rescuers worked tirelessly to keep her spirits up. They passed her food and water, a blanket to keep her warm, and even smeared vegetable oil on the rocks to reduce friction. Despite their efforts, progress was painfully slow. The hours dragged on, and Maya's exhaustion was palpable. By midnight, she was too tired to continue. The rescuers agreed to take a break, giving her time to rest and regain her strength. During that break, the cave must have felt like it was closing in on her. The silence, the cold, the weight of the earth pressing down. It's a kind of fear most of us can't even imagine. Trapped in total darkness, with only the faint glimmer of headlamps and the occasional voice to remind her she wasn't alone, Maya held on. She focused on her breathing, trying to stay calm, knowing that panic would only make her situation worse. When the rescue resumed, the chisel work finally began to pay off. Maya had managed to widen the constriction by about an inch, just enough to gain a bit of movement. The rescuers wrapped webbing around her body and carefully pulled, inch by inch, guiding her through the tightest sections of the passage. Each movement was painstakingly slow, but every inch brought her closer to freedom. At 1 a.m., 12 hours after she first became trapped, Maya finally emerged from the cave. She was exhausted, scraped up, and covered in dirt, but she was alive. Her first words summed up her relief perfectly. The rescue was a success, but it left many people wondering, how did Maya get stuck in a chamber she'd navigated before? Some speculated that she was thinner during her previous trip, or that the rocks had shifted slightly over time. Whatever the reason, this time, the cave didn't let her go without a fight. It was late on a Wednesday evening, December 1st, 2004, when 2 men, both in their mid-20s, decided to explore Devil's Punch Bowl in Guam. The pit, located in a land trust preserve near the Hilton Resort, was infamous among locals. Stories of its sheer 50-foot drop, jagged walls, and eerie atmosphere made it a tempting spot for thrill seekers. That night, curiosity got the better of them. The The preserve's gate, meant to keep people out, was unlocked. Whether it was carelessness or deliberate neglect, no one knows, but it was enough to set the stage for disaster. Armed with nothing but their phones for light, the two ventured into the preserve. They had no caving equipment, no ropes, helmets, or even flashlights. It was a reckless choice, but at that moment, it probably felt like an adventure. The night was heavy and silent, the kind of stillness that makes every sound unnervingly loud. As they approached the pit, the faint glow of their phone screens barely illuminated the rocky terrain. Devil's Punch Bowl loomed before them like a gaping maw in the earth. The jagged edges of the pit seemed to warn them to stay away. But instead, they stepped closer. One of the men, his name was never shared in the reports, decided he wanted to climb down. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, or maybe he thought it wouldn't be that difficult. Whatever his reasoning, it was a choice he wouldn't live to regret. He stepped to the edge, testing the loose, uneven rocks with his sneakers. The other man stood back, unsure, but didn't stop him. The descent started cautiously. The climber gripped the rocks, his fingers searching for holds in the dark. With no proper gear, he relied entirely on his balance and the friction of his shoes against the stone. His companion watched from above, holding his breath every time a rock crumbled beneath the climber's weight and tumbled into the pit. Then, it happened. The man slipped. Maybe he misjudged the hold, or perhaps the rocks gave way. No one will ever know for sure. For a split second he tried to recover, scrambling for grip on the crumbling wall, but gravity had already taken over. His companion could only watch in horror as he plummeted into the darkness. The sound of the fall was gut-wrenching. It wasn't just the dull thud at the bottom. It was the sickening silence that followed. The other man called out desperately, but there was no answer. Just the echo of his own voice bouncing back from the walls of the pit. Panic set in. His heart raced as he stared into the black void below, knowing he couldn't do anything to help. With shaking hands, he turned and ran, stumbling over rocks and roots in the dark. The preserve seemed endless, the path twisting and unfamiliar. Every second felt like an eternity as he searched for help. Finally, he spotted a security guard patrolling near the Hilton Resort. He waved him down and then explained the situation. The guard, alarmed by his panic, quickly radioed the police. Within minutes, rescuers were dispatched to Devil's Punch Bowl. By the time the rescue team arrived, it was clear that this would not be a rescue, but a recovery. The team, experienced in dealing with such situations, brought ropes, harnesses, and lights to illuminate the pit. As they set up their equipment, the man's companion stood nearby, shaking and staring blankly at the ground. The guilt and helplessness were written all over his face. When the team descended into the pit, the scene at the bottom was grim. The man had fallen over 50 feet onto jagged rocks, sustaining catastrophic injuries. He had died on impact, sparing him any prolonged suffering, but leaving an indelible mark on everyone involved. Carefully, the rescuers secured his body and brought him back to the surface. The process was slow and methodical, the weight of the tragedy heavy on their shoulders. When they finally emerged from the pit, the reality of what had happened was impossible to ignore. The authorities later confirmed that the man's name, along with his companions, was withheld from public reports. Perhaps it was out of respect for the family's privacy, or an effort to prevent further scrutiny of the incident. Regardless, the anonymity didn't lessen the weight of the loss. An official responsible for the property spoke about the tragedy, emphasizing that Devil's Punch Bowl was not open to the public and that the gate should have been locked. But that explanation felt hollow. It didn't bring the man back, nor did it erase the pain of those left behind. For those involved, that night was a haunting reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when the risks are underestimated. Devil's Punch Bowl, with its stark, unforgiving depths, had claimed another life. The preserve remained silent as ever, indifferent to the tragedy it had witnessed. On April 8, 2012, Guillermo Pino Jr., a 24-year-old from San Diego, joined friends and family on a trip to Arroyo Tapiado in Anza Borrego Desert State Park, California. Known for its extensive network of mud caves, the area draws adventurers eager to explore its tunnels, skylights, and unstable pits. Among the attractions was Hidden Cave, a formation notorious for its dangerously deceptive terrain. Pino, impulsive and confident, entered the cave. Casually dressed and barefoot, he explored parts of the cave while the group lingered at the campsite. Without any gear, no flashlight, water, or phone, he climbed through the rugged terrain. Emerging from the upper entrance of the cave, he spotted his companions below and called out, asking for his shoes and inviting them to join him. The group agreed to head up, but told him it would take time to climb the steep incline. Impatient, Pino decided to move further into the cave system alone, calling back and telling he will be just goofing around by then. With that, he disappeared into the upper entrance, his excitement overriding any sense of caution. Pino's steps were steady as he navigated the narrow, sloping passage. Loose dirt crumbled beneath his feet, leaving a trail, and he braced himself against the walls to maintain balance. However, the cave's deceptive nature came into play, and the terrain became more slippery, and the ground was becoming more loose. The trail started to diminish, and by then, Pino had ventured farther along. By that time, his friends climbed up, carrying his shoes. When they arrived at the upper entrance, they expected to see him waiting, but the area was silent. Pino had vanished. They called out and there was no response. Assuming he had gone further inside, they peered into the darkness, but without lights, and couldn't see him anywhere, except for some footsteps. Concern began to creep in. Initial searches revealed no sign of him. And as daylight faded, unease began to settle over the group. While they all tried to stay optimistic about the situation, putting all their faith in their friend that he will return back to them, safe and sound. The story unfolding inside the cave was far from what they would have wanted. Pino had entered a narrow passage within Hidden Cave. The passage sloped downward sharply, and the loose dirt and debris provided no stable footing. Crawling further into the constricting tunnel, Pino realized too late that he had made a grave mistake. Without a flashlight, he was disoriented, his hands feeling blindly along the walls as he tried to find a way out. The path ahead was deceptive. What appeared to be solid ground was a fragile crust of packed dirt and debris. At some point, he attempted to crawl through a vertical crack in a desperate bid to find another exit. The passage was suffocatingly tight, barely wide enough to accommodate his shoulders. Dirt and debris crumbled around him, coating his hands and face in fine dust. Halfway through the passage, disaster struck. The ground beneath him collapsed, sending him plummeting into a vertical shaft, 30 feet into the fissure. The fall struck with a jolting pain, searing through his limbs. By the time he could regain his control, he realized he couldn't move. The situation had gone from bad to worse. In fact, horribly worse. He was not just lost, dehydrated, and severely injured, but now he was stuck tightly. The impact wedged his body into the crack, his torso buried up to his chest in loose dirt. Unable to move, he was ensnared in a relentless nightmare, alone, in excruciating pain, with no hope of rescue, and in a place where darkness was absolute. Above the surface, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Pino's friends and family retraced the paths they thought he might have taken, shouting his name into the silence of the desert. Hidden Cave, like many in the area, is a maze of tight passages and false leads. Without light or proper gear, the search became increasingly futile. Hours passed, and an overwhelming sense of dread grew. By midnight, they reported Pino missing to park authorities. Within hours, local law enforcement had initiated a search effort. No one had the slightest of clues that Pino had become wedged in a crack, dirt cascading around him, pinning him tightly. With each passing second, he was fighting just to stay alive. By the following morning, April 9th, the search for Pino had expanded significantly. Teams from multiple counties, including specialized cave rescue units, joined the effort. Volunteers, professional rescuers, and even U.S. Border Patrol trackers combed the area, focusing on Hidden Cave and the surrounding formations. Pino's family watched anxiously as searchers entered cave after cave, emerging hours later with no news. Rescue teams faced numerous obstacles: unstable entrances, dangerous pits, and a lack of detailed maps for the area's cave systems. The mood among the searchers became increasingly grim as the hours turned into days. Inside the fissure, Pino's condition deteriorated rapidly. The constant pressure on his chest made it increasingly difficult to draw breath. His head throbbed from dehydration, and his lips were cracked and dry. The dirt surrounding him was suffocating, filling his nostrils and mouth whenever he tried to move. As his strength faded, his mind swung between desperation and resignation. He clung to hope that his friends will eventually find him, and this will just go away as a bad memory. But he wasn't aware that he was far from reach. The search efforts were constantly facing hurdles. Every night, the search was called off due to the inherent risks of navigating the caves in darkness. Each morning, teams returned with renewed determination, but no progress. One rescue even commented that, "It's like looking for a needle in a haystack." By April 16th, 8 days had gone by after Pino's disappearance. The San Diego Sheriff's Department officially ended the search. Resources were exhausted, and the likelihood of finding Pino alive had diminished. His family was devastated. They were on the brink of losing hope. Everyone told them it wasn't possible for him to survive by this time, but they, however, refused to give up. They continued to search the area on their own, recruiting volunteers and eventually hiring a private investigator. Pino's mother later recalled, "We couldn't just stop. We knew he was out there somewhere." 27 days after Guillermo Pino's disappearance, the breakthrough finally came. Armed with specialized equipment, including a remote camera, the investigator focused their efforts on Hidden Cave. Lowering the camera into a narrow fissure within the cave, they maneuvered it slowly, peering into spaces that had been previously inaccessible. As the camera's light illuminated the cramped vertical passage, the image that appeared on the screen sent a shockwave of anguish through those present. Pino was there, wedged tightly in the crack. His torso was partially buried in loose dirt and debris. The scene was haunting. There were no signs of life, only the stillness of someone who had succumbed to the conditions long ago. The discovery was devastating, but provided the family with some closure. The challenge now was to retrieve his body from the precarious location. The retrieval process began immediately and would take 3 days. A specialized mine rescue team from Los Angeles joined local cavers to undertake the dangerous and grueling task. One team worked from above, carefully digging through the loose dirt to avoid triggering further collapses. Meanwhile, 2 other teams approached from below, attempting to create enough space to free Pino's body. When Pino's body was finally recovered, an autopsy revealed that he had died of asphyxiation due to the compression of his chest. The exact time of his death could not be determined, but experts believed he likely succumbed within hours of becoming trapped. The tragedy left a lasting impact on those involved. For Pino's family, the grief was compounded by the knowledge of his final moments, alone, trapped, and without hope of rescue. Rescuers, too, were haunted by the incident, some questioning whether anything more could have been done. It was June 19th, 1986, a summer evening that should have been filled with teenage laughter and harmless adventure. Instead, it became the kind of night you don't forget, the kind you wish never happened. Just before dusk, 4 teenagers decided to venture into Bell Cavern, a long-abandoned mine outside Durango, Colorado. The locals called it Old Weaver Mine, and everyone knew it wasn't safe. The place was infamous for its crumbling rock walls and treacherously narrow shafts. But for 17-year-old Thad Shear, that was the draw. He wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, especially one that came with a thrill. By 8:30 p.m., they were already 200 feet inside the cavern. The deeper they went, the darker and colder it became. The cave air was thin and stale, carrying a damp chill that made it feel like the walls were closing in. The group crawled over rocks, squeezed through tight passages, and ducked under low ceilings, their nerves fraying with each step. Then Thad saw it, a narrow vertical shaft, no more than 18 inches wide. It disappeared into blackness, just wide enough for someone brave, or foolish enough to see what lay below. His friends were hesitant, urging him to let it go, but Thad had that look in his eye. He waved off their concerns with a cocky grin. Despite the obvious dangers, he decided to explore it. Before his friends could stop him, he started lowering himself down. The shaft was tight, the rock damp and crumbly. Thad used his arms and legs to brace himself, inching downward, his breathing heavy in the confined space. About 10 feet in, the situation turned dramatically. The rocks shifted under his weight, and one of his feet slipped. His body twisted awkwardly, and with a horrifying sound of scraping stone, he wedged himself firmly in the shaft. He strained against the walls, trying to wiggle free, but it was no use. The shaft was too narrow to maneuver. The more Thad struggled, the tighter the shaft seemed to grip him. His breathing grew rapid, echoing up the passage to his friends. In less than a minute, he had lost consciousness. One friend knelt at the edge of the shaft, calling his name over and over. Nothing moved below. With no time to reconsider their predicament, one of the members from the group took off running through the dark maze of the cavern. He scrambled over rocks and slipped through narrow openings, finally emerging into the night and sprinting for the nearest phone. It was nearly 10 p.m. by the time he reached the La Plata County Sheriff's Office. Back in the cavern, Thad's condition was deteriorating, trapped in the narrow shaft, with movements restricted, and the air around him was becoming stale. It was evident that the cave itself would squeeze the life out of him. He was unconscious, and the cold of the cave kept seeping into his body. The remaining teenagers could do nothing but wait in the suffocating silence, watching helplessly as Thad's limp body remained wedged in the shaft. By 2 a.m., rescue teams from Leadville, Ouray, and Silverton arrived, ready for a grueling operation. They were armed with compressed air drills, hammers, and oxygen tanks, knowing every moment counted. Navigating the rock maze to reach Thad's position was a difficult challenge. The passages were treacherous, some shrinking to just a few inches in height, forcing rescuers to crawl on their bellies, dragging heavy equipment. At 3 a.m., Keith Dahl, a seasoned 29-year-old rescuer, attempted to widen a nearby opening. The goal was to create a secondary route to the shaft where Thad was trapped. The rocks were unstable, crumbling under the pressure of his tools. Then, the unthinkable happened. The rock beneath Keith crumbled suddenly. Shouts of alarm rang out as Keith slipped, tumbling down the vertical shaft. The sound of his fall, boots scraping against rock, tools clattering, was deafening. Then came the sickening impact as his body landed directly on Thad, crushing him further into the narrow space. The rescue team froze in horror. Keith had struck his head during the fall, rendering him unconscious as well. The narrow shaft now held two unresponsive bodies. The narrow shaft was now a coffin-like trap, with two bodies wedged tightly inside. This was the nightmare scenario no one expected. A rescuer now in need of rescue. Keith had landed directly on Thad, their combined weight pressing them deeper into the shaft. The confined space became even more perilous, with Keith lying unconscious and Thad still unresponsive beneath him. In rescue operations, it's uncommon for seasoned professionals to become victims themselves, but in this case, the unstable environment turned deadly for everyone involved. The once clear plan to save Thad now spiraled into chaos as the team scrambled to figure out how to save not one, but two lives from the unforgiving grip of the cavern. The rescuers wasted no time. Oxygen tanks were rushed into the cave and passed hand to hand through the cramped, icy corridors. Every movement felt agonizingly slow. Tubes and masks were lowered into the shaft, the team shouting instructions as they struggled to secure them onto the men below. Miraculously, the oxygen began to take effect. Keith stirred first, groaning in pain, his head lolling weakly. Moments later, Thad's eyes fluttered open. He was disoriented, his face pale and clammy as he gasped for air. For a brief moment, relief washed over the rescuers. Both men were alive, but their conditions were deteriorating fast. Thad was barely coherent, his eyes darting wildly as he gasped for air. Keith, despite his regained awareness, groaned in pain, unable to move his neck. The rescuers hammered and drilled relentlessly, working to widen the shaft while avoiding further collapses. Dust and debris choked the air, and vibrations from the tools sent tremors through the fragile rock. The confined space and freezing temperatures drained the team, but they pushed forward, knowing that time was running out for Thad and Keith. The sun was already rising by the time the rescuers managed to widen the shaft enough to attempt an extraction. Nearly 12 hours had passed since Thad became trapped. Keith was pulled out first. His body was limp, his face contorted in pain. Medics rushed him to the surface, where it was confirmed that he had a fractured neck and fluid buildup in his lungs. He was barely clinging to consciousness. Thad was next. He was trembling uncontrollably, his body weakened from hypothermia and the crushing pressure of the ordeal. The rescuers carefully maneuvered him through the jagged opening, every movement slow and deliberate to avoid further injury. By the time he emerged at 9:30 a.m., he was too weak to speak, his face a ghostly white. Both men were alive, but the rescue had taken its toll. The rescuers, battered and exhausted, sat in silence, grappling with the haunting reality of how close they had come to tragedy. This was a mission none of them would ever forget, etched into their minds as a stark reminder of how quickly a routine operation could turn into a nightmare. Keith's injuries required extensive medical attention, and his recovery was to be long and grueling. Thad, though shaken, survived the harrowing night thanks to the relentless efforts of the rescue teams. This story is one of the most hair-raising, reckless nights you could imagine. A night that left one man trapped and broken, desperately fighting to stay alive. It was December 21st, 1997, a chilly evening in Arizona. Brandon Silverhorn, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt decided to head out to the Safford Shafts, a desolate area also known as Red Knolls. This place wasn't your typical hangout spot. It was a landscape of deep pits, 40 to 60 feet down, carved into the hardened bed of what was once an ancient lake. One of the pits was capped by a 4-foot-thick layer of rock, overlaying 60 feet of silt. A strange place for a late-night adventure, but it was exactly what these young men were looking for. They arrived at around 9 p.m., armed with gasoline and some questionable ideas. You'd think that standing near cliffs towering over a sheer drop would instill a sense of caution, but no. They were drawn to a narrow fissure in the rock, barely a foot square. The plan? To turn this fissure into a fiery spectacle. They poured about 4 gallons of gasoline down the crack. 4 gallons. Let that sink in. And then came the ignition. A rag soaked in gas, lit and tossed into the abyss. For a moment, there was silence. Then, chaos. The ground literally blew apart. Fire and debris shot into the air, like some hellish geyser. The crack widened in an instant, turning into this gaping hole. The sheer force of the blast hurled 4 of the men backward, leaving them bruised, scraped, and disoriented. But Brandon Silverhorn wasn't so lucky. Brandon was standing too close to the edge, peeking down when the explosion hit. His feet gave way from the impact. He rolled over and plummeted into the pit, vanishing into the earth, straight down, 40 feet, into this tilted crevice. The landing was brutal. His leg hit first, and you can imagine the sound. A sickening snap as it broke under him. He slid further into the crevice, his body twisting awkwardly. Rocks and dirt poured in after him, pinning him in place. And then the real horror. A massive slab of rock, 3 feet by 5 feet, slid down and landed on top of it all, burying and sealing him in like a grave. The others scrambled to the edge, yelling his name. Dust and smoke hung heavy in the air, making it impossible to see anything below. Let me paint you the picture. He was wedged in this crevice, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His head was forced sideways against the rock wall, his broken leg screaming with pain, and the pressure of it all strained his kidneys and abdomen that made every breath painful. That slab of rock. It was like a coffin lid, sealing him in. Dust filled the air, choking him, making it nearly impossible to cry out. The sheer panic that gripped the remaining men must have been unbearable. They kept shouting Brandon's name, but there was no response. A self-rescue attempt was beyond their experience and expertise. So, knowing the fact they couldn't do anything to get him out, they scrambled to their car and raced back to town to get help. Rescuers arrived within the hour, and when they saw the scene, they knew they were in for a long, dangerous night. The first thing they noticed was that slab of rock covering Brandon. It wasn't just heavy. It was wedged into the crevice like it was part of the earth itself. Hours had passed, and the situation Brandon was in left the rescuers questioning whether he could survive. A tripod was rigged over the chasm, and the rescuers assessed the scene. The slab of rock sealing Brandon in was massive, and the tilt of the crevice made the rescue even more dangerous. They knew they had to act fast. Brandon's injuries, the cold, and the weight of the debris could kill him if they didn't get to him soon. Meanwhile, Brandon was enduring the unimaginable. Trapped under layers of rock and dirt, he was broken and battered. A broken leg immobilized him. All their weight was crushing his body, and he was going through excruciating abdominal pain. He could feel something was wrong there. The cold was relentless, leaching the warmth from his body. Hours passed, each one a test of his will to survive. The first task was to remove the massive slab of rock. Rescuers began chiseling away at its edges to loosen it. This was slow, grueling work, as every strike of the chisel sent more debris tumbling into the crevice. Once they had enough clearance, they secured a pulley system over the tripod, attaching ropes to the rock. Hooks were driven into the surrounding bedrock to anchor the ropes, and it took the combined strength of 6 men, pulling with all their might, to lift the slab inch by inch. Finally, with one last heave, they managed to shift it out of the way. With the slab removed, the digging began. Rescuers carefully worked around Brandon, removing rocks and dirt by hand. Every move was deliberate, as they didn't want to cause further injury or risk a collapse. His body was numb with cold, his broken leg screaming with every slight shift in position. The dust had caked his throat, making it impossible to cry out. Time felt like it had slowed to a crawl, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain and hypothermia waging war on his body. Finally, after hours of painstaking effort, the rescuers reached him. They were stunned when they found him alive. By all accounts, Brandon should have been dead, crushed, suffocated, or succumbed to his injuries long ago. But there he was, battered and broken, but breathing. The final stage of the rescue involved securing him with ropes. Carefully, they maneuvered a harness around his limp body, ensuring that his broken leg was immobilized. The rescuers worked methodically, pulling him out slowly to avoid jarring his injuries. At last, after nearly 12 excruciating hours, Brandon was lifted out of the pit. The sight of him was sobering. His leg was grotesquely swollen and twisted, his face pale and smeared with dirt. His body was ice cold, and his breathing was shallow. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered he had suffered a broken leg, kidney failure, and severe hypothermia. It was a miracle that he had survived. Now, looking back on this story, it's hard not to marvel at the sheer lack of judgment involved. Pouring gasoline into a fissure and lighting it? It's the kind of thing you might expect to see in a cautionary tale, not real life. The consequences were devastating, but in a way, these men were lucky. Brandon survived, and the rest of the group walked away with injuries that could heal. On September 17th, year 2000, in Goss Canyon, California, Paul Hayden and his brother had this idea to explore an abandoned well that led into a cavern. He wasn't just some guy dabbling in diving, he was an experienced open-water diver, part of an elite Air Force rescue team. But he wasn't trained for cave diving. They started their journey late that morning, making their way down the old well shaft. It was tight and dark, the kind of place that would make most people think twice. But not Paul. He was determined. He carried a camera with him. Paul wanted to document everything, probably to share the adventure later. You could tell this wasn't just about the dive. It was about the story he could tell afterward. The two of them crawled through about 50 feet of tunnel and then down a 30-foot slope. At the bottom was a water-filled chamber, eerie and quiet. Paul anchored a rope at the edge of the water. The sturdy line was supposed to be a lifeline and guide for his planned dive. As he prepped his gear, he turned to his brother and laid out their plan. He had 2 hours of air in his tank, plenty, he believed, for a dive like this. If he didn't return by the 2-hour mark, his brother was to get help. The plan seemed solid. Paul was no stranger to underwater exploration. But this wasn't open water. This was a cavern, a place that demanded a different kind of preparation, a different level of respect. He didn't have cave diving certification, nor did he bring specialized lights or a proper guideline. But Paul's confidence in his skills carried him forward, and then he slipped beneath the surface. What Paul found beneath the water was something extraordinary. The passageways were tight, barely wide enough to maneuver through, with sharp walls and challenging maze-like tunnels. He moved carefully, navigating the tight sections, determined to see what lay ahead. Meanwhile, his brother, who had stayed behind, was holding on to the rope. He waited patiently, but after some time intervals, he'd give a tug to the rope just to make sure Paul was doing okay inside. However, 40 minutes into the dive, his tug stopped getting responses. As the minutes dragged on, the anxiety started to build. His brother gave the rope a few more tugs, but nothing. He waited longer, still nothing. The clock was about to hit the 2-hour deadline that was given by Paul. The realization hit his brother like a punch to the gut. Paul wasn't coming back up. He decided not to waste a single second anymore and scrambled out of the cavern to call for help. The rescuers arrived quickly, and after assessing the situation, they descended into the water. When the rescuers went down into that cavern, they knew they were racing against time. They started by checking the obvious places, the main passage where Paul had likely gone. It was slow going. The tunnels were tight, dark, and treacherous. It wasn't just the search that weighed on them. It was the unknown. What could have gone so wrong? When they finally located him, it was in a narrow 4-foot-wide tunnel, right below a shimmering air pocket. At first, no one spoke. Paul was completely still, his body lying in the rocky passage. It was clear he hadn't made it, but the question was, why? The first thought, naturally, was that he must have run out of air. It's what everyone assumes when something goes wrong underwater. But then, one of the rescuers checked his tank. It wasn't empty. It still had 2,500 psi, plenty of air to bring him back. That's when things started to feel strange. If he had air, why wasn't he breathing? The team exchanged glances, puzzled. But they didn't dwell on it for long. The priority was getting him out. There'd be time for answers later. Back at the surface, Paul's brother was waiting. The second they brought Paul out, his brother ran to them asking what had happened. The rescuers didn't have answers except for the fact that Paul was no more, leaving his brother puzzled and devastated. The rescuers were just as shocked. After getting a hold of his emotions, Paul's brother asked for more details. They told him they found Paul beneath an air pocket. He didn't run out of air since his tanks had enough air to get him back. One of them noticed Paul's clenched fists, and another pointed out that his regulator wasn't in his mouth. Those little details gnawed at them. It wasn't a simple drowning. Something had gone terribly wrong in that cave. It wasn't until they reviewed the camera footage later that day that the full story came together. The camera, strapped to Paul, captured his dive step by step. It showed him navigating the underwater tunnels, steady and confident. While making his way deep inside the cave, his camera sight moved towards something he noticed, shining faintly above the water. He came across that air pocket, or a bubble of air trapped in the cave's ceiling that he thought of as an air pocket. It probably piqued his curiosity. Maybe he thought it was harmless, or maybe he was simply intrigued by the way it looked and thought it'd be a cool thing to capture on camera. Nevertheless, his curiosity got the better of him, and he swam up to it to check it out. The camera showed him lifting his head out of the water, and then he does something no diver should ever do. He takes out his regulator, the thing supplying him with safe air, and takes a deep breath. The footage captured it all. The moment he inhaled, the seconds of hesitation, and then his body going limp. The rescuers realized that the air in that pocket wasn't breathable. In fact, it was not an air pocket, but it was what they call a gas pocket. The gas pocket Paul encountered wasn't the life-sustaining air it appeared to be. Its oxygen levels were likely dangerously low, or it contained a mix of toxic gases potent enough to cause immediate unconsciousness. Without realizing the risk, Paul had inhaled. In a matter of seconds, his body succumbed, falling to the cavern floor below. That single breath was enough to take his life. Once that happened, there was no chance for recovery. Looking back, the signs had been there. The clenched fists, the regulator out of his mouth, and the unused air in his tank. All of it pointed to a sudden and catastrophic failure, and now they knew why. On May 28, 1967, a group of 6 adventurers embarked on what was intended to be a routine journey into Breathing Cave, nestled in Bath County, Virginia. The party consisted of Phil Gettle, 25, his brother Lee, 23, Jim Young, 17, Fred Chiara, 15, Dale Ibison, 20, and Jay Herbane, 33. While the cave was a familiar terrain for most, Fred and Jim were relatively new to its intricacies. The group set out at 12:30 p.m., brimming with anticipation. Their objective? To navigate the new section of the cave and reach a waterfall hidden deep within. The initial trek was straightforward. The group moved cautiously, their headlamps casting shifting beams of light across the rugged limestone walls. They paused occasionally to marvel at the intricate formations that adorned the cave, stalactites hanging like frozen daggers and stalagmites rising like ancient sentinels. As the group explored side passages, their laughter and light-hearted chatter filled the otherwise silent cavern. Fred, the youngest in the group, seemed particularly captivated. His inexperience showed in his careful movements, but his enthusiasm was infectious. After an hour and a half of steady progress, the group arrived at Cathedral Passage, a 300-foot-long corridor with towering walls that vanished into darkness above. This passage, with its dramatic height and imposing scale, was a highlight of the cave, but it also presented a choice. 2 routes could be taken: a lower path involving tight crawls through eel-like passages, or an upper route requiring canyon hopping and some technical climbing. Despite the risks, the group decided on the upper route, a decision that would soon prove fatal. The climb was challenging but exhilarating. The party moved methodically, using ledges on either side of the canyon for footholds and handholds. Phil led the way, his experience evident in his confident movements. Behind him, Jay guided Fred and Jim, offering words of encouragement. Fred was notably cautious, his breaths audible as he navigated the narrow ledges. At one point, he hesitated, his hand trembling as it hovered over a slippery protrusion. Jay noticed and called back, reminding Fred to stay focused. By 2 p.m., most of the group had reached the end of the passage. Jim and Fred remained midway, with Jim ahead. Fred, straddling the canyon, used the ledges on either side to maintain his balance. The air in the passage felt heavy, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of boots against rock and the occasional clink of gear. It was a tense moment, one that demanded unwavering focus. Fred was carefully making his way along the narrow ledge, each movement deliberate and cautious. His breathing was steady, though strained, as he focused on the unforgiving drop below. His hands gripped the rough stone tightly, the jagged edges biting into his palms. Just as he shifted his weight to his left foot, disaster struck. A loose rock crumbled beneath him. It happened too fast for anyone to react. His body jolted, his balance betrayed, and the world seemed to tilt. For a fleeting instant, his arms flailed, clawing at empty air, and then he was gone, plunging into the darkness below. Fred's fall was sudden and silent. One moment, he was carefully inching forward, his hands gripping the rough rock, and the next, he slipped. A faint was all that escaped his lips as he disappeared below. Dale, positioned nearby, saw the fall but was helpless to intervene. Chaos erupted as the group scrambled to assess the situation. Phil and Lee immediately descended to Fred, finding him motionless and severely injured. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the rocky floor. His breaths were faint, shallow gasps, and his limbs lay at unnatural angles. Phil placed a trembling hand on Fred's chest, feeling the faint rise and fall. It was clear Fred was gravely injured. Jay volunteered to head to the surface to summon help. The journey out of the cave was grueling as he pushed himself through tight passages and ascended steep climbs. Upon reaching the surface, Jay flagged down another group of cavers and instructed them to contact the Potomac Speleological Club and the Cave Rescue Communications Network. He returned with a rope, a blanket, and a plastic sheet, knowing that time was against them. Meanwhile, those who remained with Fred did what they could to make him comfortable. Phil cradled Fred's head, speaking softly to him, though it was unclear if Fred could hear. The minutes dragged into hours, and Fred's breathing grew weaker. At 4:15 p.m., his chest stopped moving entirely. Phil checked for a pulse, but found none. Artificial respiration was attempted, but it was futile. Fred was gone. The rescue team arrived shortly after 5 p.m., bringing additional equipment and manpower. The task of recovering Fred's body was arduous. The narrow, jagged passages of Breathing Cave made transport incredibly difficult, and the process of maneuvering the stretcher through the cave system was slow and physically demanding. By 11:45 p.m., Fred's body was finally brought to the surface, his friends and the rescue team exhausted and grief-stricken. The coroner later confirmed that Fred had suffered a fatal concussion, along with a possible broken neck, internal injuries, a fractured wrist, and a dislocated leg. The lack of head protection in the helmet he wore likely contributed to the severity of his injuries. His death raised serious questions within the caving community. Were novices being pushed too far too soon? Were some caves, like Breathing Cave, underestimated in their risks?